The music stopped for exactly 1 second when Julian Ashcombe pulled Vivian Cross close and kissed her in front of 300 guests. Eleanor Ashcombe was standing 11 feet away, holding a glass of champagne she had not touched all evening. She did not drop it. She did not gasp. She watched her husband kiss another woman under the gold chandeliers of the Hartwell ballroom, and then she did something that would be talked about in this city for years to come. She smiled. Not a brave smile, not a mask hiding pain. A real smile, slow and warm. The kind of smile a person gives when a long wait has finally ended. Lady Prescott, standing closest to her, actually stepped back, as if the smile itself might be contagious. "Eleanor," she whispered, "did you see that?" "I saw it," Eleanor said. "Your husband just kissed Vivian Cross in the middle of the Hartwell Gala." "Yes? And you're smiling." Eleanor turned her head and looked at Lady Prescott with an expression of such calm that the older woman actually felt a chill run through her, despite the warm room and the hundreds of candles burning around them. "I am," Eleanor said. "I have never felt better in my life." Across the ballroom, Julian was still holding Vivian's waist, his lips having just left hers, his eyes scanning the crowd for the reaction he had been waiting 3 years to provoke. He wanted his wife's face to crumble. He wanted her to run from the room in tears so that every person present would understand, without him having to say a single word, that Eleanor Ashcombe was a woman he had grown tired of, a woman not worth keeping, a woman he could discard in public because he held all the power in their marriage. He found her face in the crowd. She was smiling at him. Not the tight, polite smile she gave at family dinners. Not the practiced smile she wore for photographs with his mother. A genuine, easy, almost joyful smile, as though he had just handed her the best gift of her life, instead of humiliating her in front of everyone who mattered in their social circle. Julian felt something cold slide down his spine, though he could not explain why. He had spent months imagining this moment. He had pictured her tears, her anger, perhaps even a scene that would let him play the wounded party. The husband finally free to say his marriage had been unbearable, long before Vivian ever entered his life. He had rehearsed his response to her sadness. He had not rehearsed a response to her happiness. Vivian noticed his hesitation and followed his gaze across the room. "Is that your wife?" she asked, her voice light, almost amused. "She's smiling." "I see that," Julian said quietly. "Shouldn't she be crying or throwing something at you?" "I was told she was the sensitive type." Julian did not answer. He was still watching Eleanor, and Eleanor was still watching him, and for the first time since he had met her 6 years ago, he had absolutely no idea what was going on behind her eyes. Eleanor set her champagne glass down on a passing tray with a soft, deliberate motion, as if closing a chapter of a book she had finished reading a long time ago and was only now allowed to put down. She smoothed the front of her deep blue gown, the one Julian's mother had chosen for her because it matched the family crest, the one she had worn to a dozen events she never wanted to attend, and she began to walk. She did not walk toward Julian. She did not walk toward Vivian. She walked toward the doors of the ballroom, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor, her head held at exactly the angle a duchess is taught to hold her head, calm, composed, untouchable. Whispers followed her like a current of wind moving through tall grass. Guests leaned toward one another. Fans were lifted to cover mouths that could not stop moving. "Did you see her face?" She looked almost relieved. "I would have fainted. I would have made a scene." She didn't even blink. Charlotte Bennet, Eleanor's closest friend since childhood, pushed through the crowd and caught up with her near the entrance hall, her own face pale with worry. "Eleanor, wait. Eleanor, please, talk to me." Eleanor stopped and turned, and Charlotte was startled to see that her friend's eyes were not filled with tears at all. They were bright, clear, almost lit from within, the way a person's eyes look after they have set down something impossibly heavy they have been carrying for a very long time. "I need you to trust me," Eleanor said, taking both of Charlotte's hands. "I need you to not worry about what you just saw in there." "Not worry? Eleanor." He kissed her, in front of everyone. "How can I not worry?" "Because I have been waiting for exactly this," Eleanor said, and her voice, though quiet, carried a steadiness that Charlotte had never heard from her before. not the forced steadiness of a woman holding herself together. A real steadiness, built from months, maybe years, of quiet preparation. I have been waiting for him to do something so public, so undeniable, that no one, not his lawyers, not his mother, not the entire Ashcombe family name, could ever pretend it did not happen. Charlotte blinked. "What are you talking about?" "I can't explain everything tonight," Eleanor said, "but I promise you, by the end of this month, you will understand every single thing that has happened in the last 2 years of my marriage, and you will understand why I am not crying right now." Behind them, the doors to the ballroom opened again, and Julian appeared, his jaw tight, his expression somewhere between confusion and controlled anger. He had left Vivian standing near the orchestra, her own face now uncertain, unsure why the evening had suddenly shifted away from the triumph she had been promised. "Eleanor," Julian said, his voice low, meant only for her and Charlotte to hear. "We need to talk." "Do we?" Eleanor said. It was not a question. "You cannot simply walk out of my own family's gala like nothing happened." "I'm not walking out like nothing happened, Julian." Eleanor let go of Charlotte's hands and faced her husband fully, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she did not feel her stomach twist with dread at the sight of his face. She felt only a strange, quiet distance, as though she were looking at a stranger she had once known a long time ago. "I'm walking out because something did happen, something you have been building toward for months, and something I have been preparing for even longer." Julian's eyes narrowed. "What does that mean?" "It means you should get a good night's sleep," Eleanor said. "Tomorrow is going to be a very long day for you." She turned and walked toward the front steps of the Hartwell estate, where her driver, a steady older man named Walter who had worked for her own family long before her marriage, was already waiting with the car door open, as though he had known, somehow, that tonight would be the night she finally left. Charlotte hurried after her, casting one last stunned glance back at Julian, who stood frozen in the entrance hall, his mind spinning through everything Eleanor had just said, searching for a thread of sense in it, and finding none. Inside the car, Charlotte finally let herself ask the question that had been building since the ballroom. "Eleanor, what have you been preparing?" Eleanor looked out the window as the lights of the Hartwell estate slid past, her reflection faint and calm against the glass. "Do you remember, 2 years ago, when I asked you to recommend a solicitor, someone discreet, someone who did not move in the same circles as the Ashcombe family?" Charlotte's eyes widened. "You told me it was about your father's old properties." "I lied," Eleanor said gently. "I'm sorry. I needed to be careful, and I did not want to put you in a position where you might accidentally say something to the wrong person, even you." "Eleanor, what have you been doing for 2 years?" Eleanor finally turned from the window, and in the dim light of the car, Charlotte could see that her friend's eyes, though calm, held the weight of everything she had been carrying alone. "I have been protecting myself," Eleanor said, quietly, patiently. "While everyone assumed I was simply the loyal wife who did not notice her husband was falling out of love with her." "You knew about Vivian?" "I have known for 18 months, Eleanor said. "I have known the exact dates, the exact places, more than Julian probably realizes I know. I chose not to confront him. Not because I was weak, Charlotte, but because I needed something. I needed proof, so public, so undeniable, that when I finally left, there would be no argument, no negotiation, no version of events where I was the unreasonable wife who could not forgive a small mistake." Charlotte sat back against the seat, stunned into silence for a long moment, as the car rolled through the quiet streets, past the tall iron gates of estates belonging to families who would all know the story of tonight's kiss by morning. "Tonight," Charlotte finally said. "You wanted tonight to happen." "I did not force it," Eleanor said. "I only waited for him to do what he was always going to do eventually, on his own terms, in his own arrogance. He wanted an audience. He wanted the whole city to see him choose her over me, because he thought that would break me in front of everyone who matters. And instead you smiled. Because for the first time in 3 years, Eleanor said, and here her composure finally softened just slightly, revealing something raw and true underneath. I am not the woman waiting quietly for her husband to notice her. I am the woman who has already found her way out. And tonight, without knowing it, he handed me the last piece I needed. Charlotte reached over and took her friend's hand, squeezing it tightly. What happens now? Eleanor looked forward, out through the windshield, toward the dark road leading away from the Gala, away from the Ashcombe name, away from 3 years of a marriage that had slowly hollowed her out, while the world believed she was simply a quiet, dutiful duchess.
Now, Eleanor said, I make the call I have been waiting 2 years to make.
At that exact moment, back inside the Hartwell ballroom, Julian Ashcombe stood near the orchestra, his glass of scotch untouched in his hand, his mind replaying his wife's smile over and over, unable to shake the growing, uncomfortable feeling that he had just made a terrible mistake, though he could not yet understand what that mistake was, or how deep it truly ran. Vivian approached him carefully, her earlier confidence now tinged with doubt. "Julian," she said softly, "you look like you've seen a ghost." "I think," Julian said slowly, still staring at the doors his wife had walked through. "I may have finally seen my wife for the first time in years." Vivian frowned, not understanding, and around them, the music began again. The orchestra picking up a new song, the guests slowly returning to their conversations and their dancing, though the whispers about the Duke and Duchess of Ashcombe would follow every single person in that ballroom home that night, and by morning, the story of the kiss, and the smile that answered it, would be the only thing anyone in the city wanted to talk about. Eleanor did not know exactly what the coming days would bring. She did not know how quickly Julian's world would begin to unravel, or how completely her own quiet planning would soon reshape both of their futures. But sitting in the car beside Charlotte, watching the last lights of the Hartwell estate disappear behind her, she felt something she had not felt in years. She felt free. And somewhere deep in her chest, beneath the calm exterior she had worn all evening, a small, steady voice reminded her that freedom, once claimed, could never again be taken away. The car turned onto the main road leading toward her family home, the house she had not properly lived in since her wedding day, the house that, by tomorrow morning, would become the center of everything that followed. Eleanor closed her eyes for just a moment, breathing in slowly, and allowed herself, finally, to believe that the hardest part might already be behind her. She was wrong. The hardest part was still ahead. But for tonight, at least, she allowed herself the small mercy of simply feeling the quiet, unfamiliar lightness of a burden finally set down. The morning after the gala, Eleanor sat alone in the study of her family home, a house that still smelled faintly of her father's old books and her mother's dried lavender, and she allowed herself, for the first time in years, to remember exactly how her marriage had begun. 6 years ago, when she was 22, her father had called her into this very study and told her, gently but firmly, that the Ashcombe family had made an offer. Julian Ashcombe was handsome, wealthy, connected to nearly every important family in the country, and her father believed, with the kind of quiet desperation men hide behind practical words, that this marriage would secure their own family's estate, which had been slowly sinking under debt for years. Eleanor had not loved Julian then. She had barely known him, but she had wanted, more than anything, to save her father from the shame of losing the only home he had ever known. So she had agreed, and on her wedding day, standing across from a man she had met only a handful of times, she had told herself that love could grow from respect, that kindness could grow from partnership, that a good life could be built even from a beginning like this one. For the first year, she had almost believed it. Julian was attentive in those early months, charming at dinners, generous with small gifts, and Eleanor had allowed herself the dangerous luxury of hope. She remembered the night he had brought her flowers simply because he had passed a flower stall, and thought of her, the way he had once sat with her for hours while she was ill with a fever, refusing to leave her side even when his mother insisted he had better things to do. She had loved him then, quietly, cautiously, but truly. The second year was when things began to shift, so slowly that Eleanor almost did not notice at first. Julian grew busier. His trips to the city grew longer. His attention, once so easily given, began to slip away from her like sand through open fingers. She told herself it was simply the pressure of his responsibilities, the weight of managing his family's businesses and estates. She told herself patience was a virtue, that every marriage went through seasons, that the coldness would pass. It did not pass. It deepened. By the third year, Julian barely looked at her across the dinner table. He spoke to her mostly in short, practical sentences, about schedules, about appearances they needed to make together, about the expectations of his family name. The warmth she remembered from those early months had become a distant memory, something she sometimes wondered if she had imagined entirely. It was during the third year, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, that Eleanor first found the truth. She had gone into the city to visit a dressmaker, and on her way home, her car had passed a small restaurant tucked into a quiet street, the kind of place meant for people who did not want to be seen. Through the window, for just a moment, she saw Julian sitting across from a woman with dark hair and an easy, familiar laugh, his hand resting over hers on the table, in a gesture Eleanor had not felt from him in over a year. She had told her driver to keep going. She had not said a word, and that night, lying awake in the bed she shared with a husband who had stopped truly seeing her, Eleanor had made a decision that would shape the next 2 years of her life. She would not confront him, not yet. Not with only a single moment as proof, not when she knew, with the clear, cold logic she had inherited from her father, that a man like Julian Ashcombe, backed by his family's wealth and influence, could easily deny everything, could paint her as jealous or unstable, could turn the entire situation against her if she moved too soon, with too little evidence, too little protection. Instead, she began to watch, quietly, carefully. She noted the nights he claimed to be working late. She noted the trips that grew longer than they should have been. She kept a small, private notebook, hidden in a drawer only she had the key to, recording dates and details with the same careful precision her father had once used to manage his estate's finances. And she began, slowly, to prepare. The first step had been finding Edmund Hale, a solicitor recommended to her by an old family friend, a man known for his discretion and his loyalty to families, rather than to whichever party paid him the most. Eleanor had met him for the first time, in a small office, 3 streets away from anywhere the Ashcombe name held influence, and she remembered how her hands had trembled as she explained, for the first time out loud, what she suspected about her husband. Edmund Hale had listened without judgment. He had asked careful, precise questions, and then he had told her something that changed the entire direction of her plan. "Your marriage contract," he had said, sliding a folder across the desk toward her, "was drawn up not only by your father, but reviewed, at the time, by the old Duke, Julian's father, before he passed. There is a clause here, Lady Ashcombe, that I suspect neither you nor your husband is fully aware of." Eleanor remembered the way her breath had caught as she read the document, the careful legal language describing protections written into her marriage from the very beginning, protections the old Duke had insisted upon, perhaps out of some quiet wisdom about his own son's character, perhaps simply out of an old-fashioned sense of fairness toward the woman his son was marrying. The clause stated, in language so precise it left no room for argument, that in the event of proven infidelity, publicly demonstrated and witnessed, Eleanor would retain full ownership of her family's estate, free of any debts absorbed during the marriage, along with a significant settlement drawn from the Ashcombe family's own holdings, and the right to keep her title if she so chose. It was, Edmund Hale had explained, an unusually strong protection, the kind rarely written into marriage contracts of that era, but the old Duke, it seemed, had been a careful man who did not fully trust his own son's steadiness. "This is real," Eleanor had whispered, reading the clause a second time, and then a third. "This has been here the entire time." "It has," Edmund said, "forgotten, likely, by everyone except your father, who I suspect chose not to mention it, believing it would never need to be used." Eleanor had left that office with a single, quiet thought settling into her chest, like a stone dropping into still water. She was not trapped. She had never truly been trapped. She simply had not known, until that moment, that a way out already existed, waiting patiently inside a folder in a drawer, for the day she would finally need it. From that day forward, everything Eleanor did was quiet, deliberate preparation. She continued to attend every event Julian required of her, continued to smile for photographs, continued to play the role of the composed, dutiful duchess the public expected. But behind that composed exterior, she was building something else entirely. She met with Edmund Hale every few months, always in different locations, always careful never to be seen. She confirmed, again and again, that the clause remained valid, unchanged, unchallenged. She learned exactly what kind of proof would be required, exactly what standard of public evidence the courts would demand, private suspicion was not enough. A witnessed moment, undeniable and public, was what the clause specifically required, and Eleanor understood that she would have to wait for Julian himself to provide it. She did not have to wait forever. Julian, growing more careless as his affair with Vivian Cross deepened, seemed almost to be daring the world to notice, as though some part of him wanted to be caught, wanted an excuse to end a marriage he had grown tired of, without having to bear the responsibility of ending it honorably. Eleanor watched this unfold with a patience that sometimes frightened even her. There were nights she cried, alone in rooms Julian never entered, grieving not for the marriage itself, which she had long since stopped believing in, but for the young woman she had once been, the one who had walked down the aisle believing love could be built from nothing more than good intentions and patience. But grief, she learned, could exist alongside strength. She could mourn what she had lost and still move forward with clear, steady purpose. Charlotte had noticed the change in her over those 2 years, though she had not understood its cause, only remarking once, gently, that Eleanor seemed somehow both sadder and stronger than she used to be. "I am becoming someone new," Eleanor had told her then, though she had not explained further. Now, sitting in her father's old study the morning after the gala, Eleanor opened the drawer that held her private notebook, filled with 2 years of careful, patient documentation, and beside it, the folder Edmund Hale had given her, containing the clause that would finally set her free. The kiss at the Hartwell Gala had been witnessed by 300 people. Photographs had almost certainly already been taken. By tonight, the story would be printed in every society paper in the city. It was, without question, the undeniable, public proof the clause required. Eleanor picked up the telephone on her father's old desk and dialed a number she had memorized 2 years ago, but never before had reason to call outside of their scheduled meetings. Edmund Hale answered on the second ring, his voice steady, as though he had been expecting this exact call for a very long time. "Lady Ashcombe," he said, "I heard about the gala." "Then you know why I'm calling," Eleanor said. "I do." There was a brief pause on the line, and when Edmund spoke again, his voice carried something Eleanor had rarely heard from him before, a note of quiet satisfaction, as though he too had been waiting 2 years for this exact morning. "Are you ready to begin?" Eleanor looked out the window of the study, toward the gardens her mother had once tended, now slightly overgrown, but still beautiful in their own quiet way, and she felt the last hesitation inside her finally settle into certainty. "I have been ready for 2 years, she said. "Let's begin." Julian Ashcombe did not sleep at all the night of the gala. He had returned to the Ashcombe estate near midnight, alone, having sent Vivian home in a separate car after she asked, 3 times, why he seemed so distracted, and 3 times he had failed to give her a real answer. He sat in his study until nearly dawn, replaying his wife's smile over and over in his mind, searching for some explanation that made sense, and finding none. By the time the sun rose over the estate grounds, he had convinced himself that Eleanor's calm had simply been a performance, a proud woman refusing to give him the satisfaction of watching her break in public. He told himself she would arrive home eventually, perhaps later that day, and that when she did, the tears would finally come, along with the pleading, the anger, the scene he had expected all along. She did not come home that day, or the next. By the 3rd morning, Julian's confusion had curdled into irritation, and he sent a message to the family home Eleanor had grown up in, requesting, in the formal language he always used when he wanted to appear reasonable rather than desperate, that she return to the estate so they could discuss the matter privately. The response came not from Eleanor, but from a solicitor's office Julian had never heard of, informing him, in polite but unmistakably formal language, that Lady Ashcombe had retained legal counsel, and that any further communication regarding the marriage should be directed through her representative, a man named Edmund Hale. Julian read the letter 3 times, before the words fully registered. "Legal counsel," he said aloud, alone in his study, the paper trembling slightly in his hand. "She's hired a solicitor." His first instinct was anger, quickly followed by something closer to disbelief. Eleanor had never, in 6 years of marriage, made a single independent decision of this magnitude without consulting him first, or at the very least, informing him after the fact. She had always deferred to him on matters of business, of law, of anything beyond the running of their household and the planning of their social calendar. The idea that she had quietly retained a solicitor, without his knowledge, felt almost impossible to believe. He called his own family's longtime lawyer, a heavy-set, cautious man named Gerald Whitmore, and demanded he look into the matter immediately. Gerald arrived at the estate within the hour, his expression carefully neutral in the way lawyers learn to keep their faces when they suspect bad news is coming. "Your Grace," Gerald said, settling into the chair across from Julian's desk. "I've made some initial inquiries. Edmund Hale is a respected solicitor, known primarily for handling matters involving inheritance disputes and marriage contracts. He does not typically take cases, unless he believes he has strong legal ground." "What kind of ground could Eleanor possibly have?" Julian asked, though even as he said it, a faint, uncomfortable memory stirred somewhere in the back of his mind. Something about his father, years ago, insisting on reviewing every clause of the marriage contract personally, before allowing the wedding to proceed. "I don't yet know the specifics," Gerald admitted. "But Your Grace, I would strongly recommend we review the original marriage contract in full, before responding to Mr. Hale's office." They found the contract that afternoon, buried in the family archive room among decades of similar documents, and as Gerald read through the pages, his careful, neutral expression slowly gave way to something closer to alarm. "Your Grace," he said quietly, after several long minutes of reading, "there is a clause here, added at the specific request of your late father, that I do not believe has ever been discussed or amended since the day of your wedding."
"What clause?"
Gerald turned the document around so Julian could read it himself, and as Julian's eyes moved down the page, absorbing the careful legal language his father had insisted upon nearly 6 years ago, the color slowly drained from his face. "This can't be right," Julian said. "This gives her everything, the estate, the settlement, the title, all of it, if she can prove infidelity." "Publicly demonstrated infidelity," Gerald clarified grimly. "Witnessed by a credible number of individuals, not merely alleged." Julian sat back in his chair, his mind racing back to the ballroom, to the kiss, to the 300 guests who had watched him press his lips against Vivian's, in full view of the entire gathering. He had wanted an audience. He had wanted the moment to be undeniable, unmistakable, so that no one could later claim the marriage had ended amicably or quietly. He had gotten exactly what he wanted, and it had cost him everything. "There has to be a way to challenge this," Julian said, his voice rising slightly. "A way to argue the clause is outdated, or that it was never properly ratified, or—" "Your Grace," Gerald interrupted gently, but firmly, "I have handled contracts like this one for over 20 years. Your father was known for his precision in legal matters. This clause was drafted by one of the most respected legal minds of his generation, reviewed and signed by both families, and witnessed by 3 separate parties at the time of the wedding. It is, as far as I can tell after this initial review, entirely valid." Julian stood abruptly, walking to the window of his study, staring out over the grounds of an estate that had belonged to his family for 4 generations, an estate he had always assumed was untouchably his, regardless of whatever happened in his personal life. "She knew," he said quietly, almost to himself. "She's known about this clause the entire time." "It would seem so," Gerald said. "And she's known about Vivian." Gerald did not answer immediately, allowing the silence to confirm what Julian was only now beginning to fully understand. "She's been waiting," Julian said, turning back to face his lawyer, a strange mixture of anger and grudging, unwilling respect beginning to settle into his expression. "This entire time, while I thought she was simply too naive or too passive to notice what was happening in our marriage, she was quietly building a case against me." "It would appear that way, Your Grace." Julian sat back down slowly, the full weight of the situation finally settling over him. He thought of the ballroom, of Eleanor's calm smile, of the way she had set down her champagne glass, with such quiet, deliberate composure, before walking out. He had mistaken her stillness for weakness. He understood now, with a clarity that felt almost physically painful, that her stillness had been the exact opposite. "What are my options?" he asked finally. Gerald hesitated before answering, choosing his words with the careful precision of a man delivering news he knew his client would not want to hear. "Given the strength of the clause, and given that the infidelity in question was witnessed by hundreds of guests at a public event, I would advise, in the strongest possible terms, that we attempt to negotiate a settlement with Mr. Hale's office, rather than pursue this matter through the courts." A public legal battle would only draw more attention to the circumstances, and I do not believe, based on my initial review, that we would prevail. You're telling me to give her what she wants? I'm telling you, Gerald said carefully, that the alternative is a public trial that would almost certainly expose every detail of the affair to the press, damage the family's reputation far beyond what has already been done, and still end, in all likelihood, with the same result, only after considerable additional cost and public embarrassment. Julian sat in silence for a long moment, his hands pressed against his temples, the weight of the last several days finally catching up with him all at once. He thought of Vivian, who had called twice that morning, her messages growing increasingly anxious, as she too began to sense that something had shifted, that the future she had been promised was no longer as certain as it once seemed. He thought of his mother, who would need to be informed, whose reaction he could already imagine with painful clarity, the disappointment, the quiet fury at the damage this would do to a family name she had spent her entire life protecting. And he thought, finally, of Eleanor, the quiet, composed woman he had married 6 years ago, and had slowly stopped seeing as the years passed. A woman he had assumed would always simply endure whatever he chose to do, because that was what she had always done before. He understood now that he had been wrong about her in almost every way that mattered. Set up the meeting, Julian said finally, his voice heavy. With Hale's office, I want to understand exactly what she's asking for. Yes, Your Grace, Gerald said, gathering the marriage contract carefully and sliding it back into its protective folder. I'll arrange it for as soon as possible. As Gerald left the study, Julian remained seated behind his desk, staring at the closed door, replaying, once again, the image of his wife's smile from 3 nights earlier. He had spent that entire evening trying to understand what it meant, and now, finally, he understood. It had not been the smile of a woman losing everything. It had been the smile of a woman who had already won. The meeting between Gerald Whitmore and Edmund Hale took place 4 days after the gala, in a neutral office space neither family had any connection to, chosen specifically by Edmund to avoid even the appearance of favoritism. Eleanor did not attend in person. She sat instead in Edmund's private office, a cup of tea slowly going cold on the table beside her, while she waited for word of how the negotiation was proceeding. Charlotte sat with her, though neither woman spoke much, the tension of waiting settling heavily into the quiet room. You could have gone, Charlotte said eventually. It's your marriage, your future. Edmund advised against it, Eleanor said. He says it's better if I appear, for now, as someone who has already moved past this. Someone confident enough in her position that she does not need to fight for it personally. And are you confident, I mean? Eleanor considered the question honestly before answering. I am confident in the clause. I am confident in what I am owed. What I am not yet confident about is what comes after. Across the city, in the neutral meeting room, Julian sat beside Gerald, his posture stiff, his expression carefully controlled in a way that reminded Gerald of every difficult negotiation he had witnessed over his long career. Powerful men, trying desperately to appear as though they still held control of a situation that had already slipped entirely out of their hands. Edmund Hale arrived precisely on time, carrying a single folder, his manner calm and unhurried, in a way that immediately unsettled Julian more than any display of aggression could have. Your Grace, Edmund said, taking his seat across the table. Thank you for agreeing to meet. Let's not pretend this is a courtesy, Julian said. You know exactly what you're asking for. I know exactly what Lady Ashcombe is legally entitled to, Edmund corrected calmly. There is a difference. Gerald placed a hand briefly on Julian's arm, a small gesture urging patience, before speaking himself. We have reviewed the clause in full. We do not dispute its validity. However, we would like to discuss the specific terms of settlement, given the circumstances. Of course, Edmund said, opening his folder and sliding a document across the table. Here are Lady Ashcombe's requirements. Full ownership of her family's estate, free of any debts incurred jointly during the marriage. A settlement amount equal to the figure outlined in the original clause, adjusted for 6 years of inflation, which our own financial advisors have calculated precisely, and retention of her title, should she choose to keep it, along with a formal, dignified public statement acknowledging the end of the marriage, without assigning blame in a manner that would damage either party unnecessarily. Londa Julian read through the document slowly, his jaw tightening with each line. The numbers were significant, though not, he had to admit privately, unreasonable, given what the clause had always promised. What struck him more than the figures themselves was the final request, the one about a dignified public statement. "She wants to protect my reputation," Julian said, almost to himself, genuine confusion in his voice. "After everything, she still wants to avoid humiliating me publicly." "Lady Ashcombe has never wanted to humiliate you," Edmund said. "She has only ever wanted what was fairly owed to her, and the freedom to build a life away from a marriage that stopped serving either of you a long time ago." Julian sat back in his chair, studying the document in front of him, and for the first time since the gala, something other than anger and wounded pride began to surface in his expression, a kind of tired, reluctant understanding. "She could have destroyed me," he said quietly. "The papers would have run every detail she wanted them to. My mother's reputation, the family's businesses, all of it could have been dragged through months of public scandal if she had chosen a different approach." "She could have," Edmund agreed. "It was never her intention. Lady Ashcombe wants her freedom and what is legally hers, nothing more." Gerald leaned forward slightly. "We would like 48 hours to review the settlement figures in detail before responding formally." "That's reasonable," Edmund said, closing his folder. "Though I should mention, given the number of guests who witnessed the events at the gala, and given that at least 2 society papers have already reached out to my office requesting comment, I would advise moving quickly. Lady Ashcombe has no interest in dragging this out publicly, but she also will not wait indefinitely while the story continues to circulate without resolution." After Edmund left, Julian remained seated at the table for a long moment, staring at the settlement document, while Gerald quietly gathered his own papers. "You're going to accept it," Gerald said, not quite a question. "What choice do I have?" Julian said, though his voice carried none of the anger it had held days earlier. "She was right about everything. She was right that I would never have expected this from her. She was right that I underestimated her completely." That evening, Julian returned to the Ashcombe estate to find his mother, the Dowager Duchess Margaret, waiting for him in the drawing room, her expression grave, a folded newspaper resting on the table beside her. "I assume you've seen this," she said, gesturing toward the paper without looking at it directly, as though the words themselves were distasteful to acknowledge. Julian picked it up and scanned the headline, a detailed, though carefully worded, account of the events at the Hartwell Gala, along with speculation about the sudden, unexplained absence of the Duchess from public life over the following days. "Mother," Julian began. "Do not," Margaret said, holding up a hand. "I do not wish to hear excuses, Julian. I wish to understand how my son managed to lose not only his wife, but very possibly his family's estate, over an affair so carelessly conducted that it was witnessed by half of society in a single evening." "It's not going to cost us the estate," Julian said, though his voice lacked conviction. "The main estate remains protected under separate holdings. It's Eleanor's own family property, and a settlement that the clause guarantees her." "A settlement of what magnitude?" Julian told her the figure, and watched his mother's face grow pale, then hard, then finally settle into an expression of controlled, icy disappointment that Julian remembered from childhood, the same look she had given him as a boy whenever he had failed to meet the standards expected of an Ashcombe heir. "Your father," Margaret said slowly, "insisted on that clause against my objections. I told him it was unnecessary, overly cautious, an insult to the trust a marriage should be built upon. He told me, and I remember his exact words, that he had watched enough young men grow careless with power to know that protection should always exist for the party with less of it. You're saying he expected this, that I would do something like this?" "I am saying," Margaret said, "that your father knew you better than either of us wanted to admit, even then, when you were only 26 years old and freshly engaged to a woman who adored you." Julian sat down heavily in the chair across from his mother, the newspaper still in his hand, the weight of the last week finally settling fully into his chest. He thought of Eleanor as she had been in those first months of their marriage, bright and hopeful, genuinely happy in a way he had not truly appreciated at the time, because he had assumed, wrongly, that her happiness was simply guaranteed, that it would always be there whenever he chose to return his attention to her. He understood now, far too late, exactly what he had allowed himself to lose. I'll sign the settlement, he told his mother quietly. There's no other reasonable path forward. Margaret studied her son for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had softened slightly, though the disappointment remained clear underneath. Then sign it with whatever dignity you have left, Julian, and learn something from this, because I do not believe Eleanor Ashcombe is a woman the world has seen the last of. Julian looked up at his mother, uncertain exactly what she meant, and Margaret simply shook her head and rose from her chair, leaving him alone in the drawing room with the newspaper, the settlement document, and the slow, uncomfortable realization that the woman he had underestimated for 6 years had just proven, decisively and permanently, exactly how badly he had misjudged her. Vivian Cross had called Julian 11 times over 5 days before he finally answered. She had expected, in the days following the gala, that Julian would come to her, that the public kiss would mark the beginning of a new chapter, one where he finally left his quiet, unremarkable wife and stepped fully into a life with her, a life she had spent nearly 2 years imagining, in careful, hopeful detail. Instead, she had heard nothing but silence, broken only by brief, distracted replies to her messages, each one shorter and colder than the last. When Julian finally agreed to meet her, he chose a private room at a restaurant far from the city center, the kind of place where no one from their usual circles would think to look for either of them. "You've been avoiding me," Vivian said, as soon as she sat down across from him, her voice carrying an edge she rarely allowed him to hear. "I've had a difficult week," Julian said. "Difficult?" Vivian let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "Julian, we kissed in front of 300 people. I thought that meant something. I thought that meant you were finally ready to leave her." Julian rubbed his temples, exhaustion evident in every line of his face. "It's not that simple." "Why not? You told me, more than once, that your marriage was over in every way that mattered, that you and Eleanor were simply going through the motions for the sake of appearances." "I know what I told you," Julian said. "Then what's changed?" Julian hesitated, weighing how much to explain, before finally speaking with the tired honesty of a man who no longer had the energy to maintain careful appearances. "There's a clause in our marriage contract, one I didn't know existed until a few days ago. It entitles Eleanor to a significant settlement, given the circumstances of the affair being made public the way it was." Vivian's expression shifted, confusion giving way slowly to something sharper. "How significant?" "Significant enough that my family's lawyers advise settling quickly, rather than fighting it in court." "So this is about money." "It's about a great many things," Julian said. "The family name, my mother, the estate." Vivian sat back in her chair, studying him with an expression that had grown noticeably cooler over the course of the conversation. "You're telling me that the woman I assumed was too soft, too passive to fight for anything, has managed to legally take a significant portion of your family's wealth, and you're simply going to let her?" "There isn't much choice." "There's always a choice, Julian." Vivian leaned forward, her voice tightening. "I gave up 2 years of my life for this. I turned down other opportunities because you promised me, more than once, that this was building towards something real." "I never lied to you about how I felt," Julian said carefully. "But I also never intended for things to unfold the way they did that night at the gala. I acted impulsively. I wanted to make a point, and I didn't think through the consequences properly." "You wanted to hurt her," Vivian said flatly. "You wanted to see her break in front of everyone, and it backfired. And now you're sitting here telling me that the fallout from your own decision is somehow inconveniencing our future together." Julian did not answer immediately, and in his silence, Vivian found the answer she had been dreading since she first heard the whispers about Eleanor's calm, unshaken smile in the ballroom. "You're not going to fight for us," she said quietly, "are you?" "I need time," Julian said. "The settlement, my mother, the business affairs tied to the estate, all of it needs to be resolved before I can think clearly about anything else." "That's not an answer. It's the only one I have right now." Vivian stood slowly, gathering her coat from the back of her chair, her expression settling into something cold and final. "You know, Julian, I used to think Eleanor was foolish for staying with you as long as she did, for not seeing what was happening right in front of her. I understand now that she saw everything. She simply chose her moment far more carefully than either of us gave her credit for." "Vivienne, I hope the settlement is worth whatever you thought you were gaining that night, Vivian said, and then she turned and walked out of the private room, leaving Julian alone at the table, the weight of yet another loss settling over him with quiet, undeniable finality. Meanwhile, across the city, whispers about the Ashcombe scandal had continued to spread through every level of society, growing more detailed with each retelling. The society papers, initially cautious in their reporting, had grown bolder as more guests from the gala came forward with their own accounts of the evening, each version adding new texture to the story of the Duke's careless kiss and the Duchess's unshaken, almost triumphant smile. What struck people most, as the story spread, was not the affair itself. Unfaithful husbands were, unfortunately, not an entirely uncommon feature of society marriages, but Eleanor's reaction, the composure, the complete absence of the humiliation Julian had clearly expected to provoke. Slowly, a new narrative began to take shape in the drawing rooms and dinner parties of the city, one that painted Eleanor not as a woman scorned, but as a woman who had somehow, quietly and completely, outmaneuvered her husband at his own game. Lady Prescott, who had witnessed the kiss firsthand, found herself repeating the story at nearly every social gathering she attended that week. "You should have seen her face," she told one group after another. Not a single tear. She looked at him, as though he had just done her the greatest favor of her life. The story reached Charlotte's family, Eleanor's oldest friends, and eventually even distant relations, who had not spoken to Eleanor in years. All of them suddenly eager to reconnect, to offer support, to align themselves with a woman who was quickly becoming, in the eyes of society, less a victim of scandal and more a figure of quiet, admirable strength. Eleanor herself remained largely withdrawn from public life during this period, choosing, on Edmund's careful advice, to let the settlement negotiations conclude before making any public statements of her own. She spent her days at her family home, working alongside Edmund to finalize the details of the agreement, and her evenings with Charlotte, slowly beginning to rebuild the parts of herself that 6 years of a difficult marriage had worn thin. "I keep hearing about how people are talking about you," Charlotte told her one evening, the two of them sitting in the same study, where Eleanor had once received the news of her father's arranged marriage proposal years earlier. "You've become something of a legend already." "I don't want to be a legend," Eleanor said. "I just want my life back." "I think," Charlotte said gently, "you might end up with more than that." Eleanor did not fully understand what her friend meant, not yet, but as the days passed and the settlement negotiations moved steadily toward their conclusion, she began to feel, for the first time in years, the quiet stirrings of something that felt almost like curiosity about her own future, a future she had not allowed herself to imagine in a very long time. Back at the Ashcombe estate, Julian sat alone in his study most evenings now, the house feeling emptier than it ever had during the years Eleanor had lived there, despite how little attention he had paid her presence at the time. Vivian no longer called. His mother spoke to him only when necessary, her disappointment settling into a permanent, quiet distance between them. He had gained, briefly, the freedom he thought he wanted. He had not expected it to feel this hollow. Margaret Ashcombe arrived at Eleanor's family home unannounced, on a quiet Thursday afternoon, a visit that surprised the household staff nearly as much as it surprised Eleanor herself. "Your Grace," the housekeeper said, hurrying into the study, where Eleanor sat reviewing documents with Edmund Hale. "The Dowager Duchess is here. She's asking to speak with you privately." Eleanor exchanged a brief glance with Edmund, who nodded slightly, giving her the space to decide for herself how to handle the unexpected visit. "Show her in," Eleanor said finally. "I'll speak with her alone." Margaret entered the study a few minutes later, her posture as formal and composed as ever, though Eleanor noticed, with some surprise, a softness in her mother-in-law's expression that she had rarely seen during the 6 years of their acquaintance. "Eleanor," Margaret said, taking the seat offered to her. "Thank you for agreeing to see me." "Of course," Eleanor said, "though I admit I'm curious about the reason for the visit." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, choosing her words carefully. "I wanted to speak with you directly, away from the lawyers and the settlement papers and the noise of the entire situation. I wanted to understand, from you, how long you've known about my son's behavior." Eleanor considered the question honestly before answering. 18 months, with certainty. Though I suspect, if I am honest with myself, some part of me sensed the change in him even earlier than that. "And you said nothing," I said nothing, Eleanor confirmed. Because I understood, even then, that confronting Julian without proof, without protection, would only result in him finding a way to make the entire situation my fault. I had watched enough marriages in our circle dissolve that way. The wife left with nothing but her reputation in ruins, while the husband continued on, with barely a mark against his name. Margaret's expression tightened slightly, though not with anger directed at Eleanor. You are not wrong about how these situations typically unfold. I have watched it happen myself, more than once, to women I considered friends. I did not want to become one of those women, Eleanor said. So I waited, and I prepared, and I made certain that when the truth finally became public, there would be no question of who was in the right. Margaret studied her for a long moment, something like reluctant admiration flickering across her carefully composed features. My husband, Julian's father, once told me that Julian would need a strong woman beside him, someone steady enough to balance his impulsiveness. I believed, at the time of your wedding, that you might be too gentle for that role. I see now how wrong I was. I was gentle, Eleanor said quietly. Once, I think, in some ways, marrying into this family taught me how not to be. I am sorry for that, Margaret said, and the words seemed to cost her something, an admission she was clearly unaccustomed to making. I knew, for some time, that Julian was not treating you as he should. I told myself it was not my place to interfere in your marriage, but I wonder now if that was simply an easier excuse than actually confronting my son's failings. Eleanor was quiet for a moment, absorbing the unexpected honesty of the conversation. I don't hold you responsible for Julian's choices, she said finally. You did not force him to be careless, or unkind, or unfaithful. Those were his decisions alone. Perhaps, Margaret said, though I raised him, and I cannot fully separate myself from the man he became. She paused, then continued, her voice gentler than Eleanor had ever heard it. I want you to know, whatever happens with the settlement, whatever path your life takes from here, that I do not consider you responsible for the end of this marriage. I consider Julian responsible, entirely, and I have told him as much. Eleanor felt something unexpected loosen in her chest, a tension she had carried for so long she had almost stopped noticing it was there. Thank you, she said. That means more than you might realize. The two women sat together for a while longer, the conversation shifting to gentler topics, memories of Eleanor's early years in the family, small kindnesses Margaret had shown her that Eleanor had nearly forgotten amid the difficulties of the marriage's final years. By the time Margaret rose to leave, something had shifted between them. Not quite friendship, but a mutual respect neither had expected to find on this particular afternoon. After Margaret's car pulled away from the house, Eleanor returned to the study, where Edmund had been quietly reviewing settlement documents during her absence. That looked like an important conversation, Edmund observed. It was, Eleanor said, settling back into her chair. Though I'm still trying to understand exactly what it means for everything that comes next. Perhaps it simply means, Edmund said, that the people who matter most are beginning to see you clearly, for the first time in a long while. Eleanor thought about those words later that evening, sitting alone in the garden her mother had once tended, watching the last light of the day fade slowly over the grounds. She thought about the young woman she had been on her wedding day, hopeful and uncertain, and the woman she had slowly become over 6 difficult years, patient, watchful, quietly building a future she had not been able to fully imagine until now. She thought, too, about a conversation she had shared with her own mother years earlier, before the wedding, before any of this had begun. Her mother had passed only a year into the marriage, but Eleanor still remembered, with startling clarity, the advice she had offered on the eve of the wedding. Marriage will ask you to become someone new, her mother had said, sitting beside her on this very same garden bench. Sometimes, it asks you to become someone smaller, quieter, more accommodating than you truly are. And sometimes, if you are strong enough, it teaches you exactly how capable you really are, even when the people around you underestimate you completely. At the time, Eleanor had not fully understood what her mother meant. She understood now, sitting alone in the same garden 6 years later, that her mother's words had been less advice than quiet prophecy, one that had taken the entire painful arc of her marriage to fully reveal itself. She was not the same woman who had walked down the aisle believing that patience and kindness alone could build a lasting love. She had learned, through years of careful observation and quiet strategy, that survival sometimes required a different kind of strength, one built not from softness, but from clear eyes and steady resolve. And yet, sitting in the fading evening light, Eleanor did not feel hardened by everything the marriage had taught her. She felt, instead, something closer to gratitude, strange as it seemed, for the version of herself that had emerged from those difficult years. She had not lost herself in the marriage, as she had feared she might during its darkest moments. She had simply become someone new, someone capable of protecting herself, someone who understood the true weight of her own worth in a way she never had as a hopeful, uncertain 22-year-old bride. Charlotte found her there a while later, the garden nearly dark now, the first stars beginning to appear over the estate. "You've been out here for hours," Charlotte said, settling onto the bench beside her. "I've been thinking," Eleanor said. "About Julian?" "About everything," Eleanor said. "About who I was before this marriage, and who I've become because of it, and who I might still become, now that it's finally ending." Charlotte reached over and took her friend's hand, the same gesture she had offered on the night of the gala, though the mood between them now felt entirely different, lighter, filled with something that felt almost like hope. "And who do you want to become?" Charlotte asked. Eleanor looked up at the darkening sky, considering the question carefully before answering, her voice steady and sure, in a way it had not been in a very long time. "Someone who chooses her own life," she said, "instead of simply enduring whatever life happens to her." Above them, the first stars continued to appear, scattered and quiet across the vast evening sky. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Eleanor allowed herself to imagine a future entirely of her own making. The final settlement meeting took place 3 weeks after the gala, in the same neutral office where the first negotiations had begun, though the atmosphere this time carried none of the tension of that earlier encounter. Julian arrived early, a habit Gerald had noticed developing over the past weeks, as though his client had grown eager to simply finish the process, rather than delay it further. He sat quietly at the table, the settlement documents already reviewed and approved by his own legal team, waiting for Eleanor and Edmund to arrive. When Eleanor entered the room, she looked different than Julian remembered from the gala, though he struggled at first to identify exactly what had changed. Her posture was the same, elegant and composed as always, but something in her expression had shifted, a lightness he had not seen from her in years, perhaps not since the earliest months of their marriage. "Eleanor," Julian said, rising slightly as she took her seat across from him. "Julian," she replied, her tone polite but distant, the voice of someone addressing a business associate rather than a husband of 6 years. Edmund and Gerald exchanged the final documents, walking through each clause of the settlement one last time to ensure both parties fully understood the terms. Eleanor's family estate would be returned to her entirely, free of any debts absorbed during the marriage. A significant financial settlement, calculated precisely according to the original clause and adjusted for the years that had passed, would be transferred to accounts under her sole control. She would retain her title, should she choose, though the formal announcement would simply state that the couple had amicably ended their marriage, without assigning public blame to either party, protecting both the Ashcombe family name and Eleanor's own reputation from further scandal. "Is there anything either party wishes to add before we finalize the signatures?" Edmund asked, once the review was complete. Julian was quiet for a moment, studying Eleanor across the table, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight neither Gerald nor Edmund had expected. "I owe you an apology," he said, "not for the settlement itself, which I understand is fair, and rightfully yours, but for 6 years of not truly seeing you, of taking your patience and your kindness for granted, until it was far too late to matter." Eleanor met his gaze steadily, and for a long moment, the room was silent. "Thank you for saying that," she said finally. "I won't pretend it changes what happened, but I appreciate that you said it." "I know it doesn't," Julian said. "I don't expect it to. I only wanted you to hear it, before this is finished." Eleanor nodded slowly, and something in her expression softened, not into forgiveness exactly, but into a kind of quiet peace, the sense of a chapter closing cleanly, rather than bitterly. "I hope," she said, "that whatever comes next for you, you find a way to become someone who values the people around him before it's too late to matter." Julian did not respond immediately, absorbing her words, and then he simply nodded, understanding that no further response was needed, or perhaps deserved. The signatures were completed within the hour, each party signing the final documents with the careful formality the occasion demanded. When it was finished, Edmund gathered the papers into his folder, and Gerald did the same, both lawyers offering brief, professional congratulations on reaching a resolution without the public battle that had once seemed almost inevitable. As the meeting concluded, and everyone began to rise from the table, Julian spoke once more, his voice quieter now, meant only for Eleanor. "For what it's worth," he said, "I don't think I ever properly understood what I had, until I watched you walk away from it without looking back." "I looked back plenty of times, Julian," Eleanor said gently. "For years, I simply stopped waiting for you to notice." She left the office a few minutes later, Edmund walking beside her, and as they stepped out into the afternoon sunlight, Eleanor felt something settle fully into place inside her chest, a sense of completion she had been waiting 2 long years to feel. "How do you feel?" Edmund asked, as they walked toward the waiting car. "Lighter," Eleanor said, considering the question honestly. "Freer than I've felt in longer than I can remember." Word of the settlement spread through society circles within days, though the careful language of the official statement, along with the discretion both families had ultimately chosen to exercise, meant the story faded from the front pages far more quickly than it might have otherwise. What remained, in the quiet conversations of drawing rooms and dinner parties across the city, was not scandal, but something closer to respect for the composed, dignified way Eleanor had handled the entire situation from beginning to end. Julian's own reputation, by contrast, suffered considerably in the weeks that followed. Business partners, who had once eagerly sought alliances with the Ashcombe family, began quietly distancing themselves, unwilling to be associated too closely with a man whose public carelessness had cost his family such a significant portion of its wealth and standing. Invitations to important social events grew noticeably less frequent. Even his own mother, though she continued to support him as her son, could not fully hide the disappointment that had settled permanently into her manner whenever the topic of the marriage arose. Vivian Cross, for her part, disappeared from Julian's life entirely within weeks of their final, difficult conversation at the private restaurant. She was seen, some months later, attending events with a different circle entirely. Her association with the Ashcombe scandal, quietly, deliberately left behind, as she worked to rebuild a reputation that had been damaged nearly as much as Julian's own. Julian remained largely alone in the months following the settlement, the vast estate feeling emptier with each passing week, the weight of everything he had lost settling more heavily over him as the initial anger and confusion of those first difficult days gave way to a quieter, more permanent kind of regret. He had wanted, on the night of the gala, to prove that he held all the power in his marriage, that Eleanor's quiet devotion had simply been the natural response of a woman who understood her own limited options. He understood now, with painful clarity, exactly how wrong that assumption had been. Eleanor, meanwhile, began the slow, careful work of rebuilding a life entirely her own. She moved back into her family estate permanently, overseeing its restoration with the same careful precision she had once applied to documenting the details of her husband's affair. The gardens her mother had once tended were restored to their former beauty. The study where her father had once delivered the news of her arranged marriage became, once again, a place of quiet comfort rather than difficult memory. She reconnected with old friends she had drifted from during the difficult years of her marriage, rebuilding relationships that had grown distant, while she focused all her energy on simply surviving each day. Charlotte remained close by her side throughout this period, watching with quiet pride, as her oldest friend slowly rediscovered pieces of herself that 6 years of a difficult marriage had nearly buried entirely. It was during this period of rebuilding, several months after the settlement was finalized, that Eleanor received an unexpected letter, one that would open an entirely new chapter of her life, though she did not yet know it as she carefully broke the seal and began to read. The letter was written in handwriting Eleanor recognized instantly, though she had not seen it in nearly 8 years. Henry Whitfield had been her closest friend during childhood, the son of a family whose estate bordered her own father's property, and the two of them had spent countless summers together as children, exploring the fields and woods between their two homes, with the fearless freedom only children possess. Henry had gone away to study abroad when Eleanor was 17, and though they had exchanged occasional letters for the first year or two, the correspondence had gradually faded as their lives moved in separate directions. Eleanor toward her arranged marriage, Henry toward a career that had taken him across several countries over the years since. She opened the letter carefully, her heart beating with an unexpected flutter of nostalgia as she began to read. Eleanor, I heard, through mutual acquaintances, about the ending of your marriage, and I hope you will forgive the presumption of an old friend reaching out after so many years of silence. I have thought of you often over the years, more often than perhaps I should admit in a letter, and I wanted you to know that whatever difficulties you have faced, I have no doubt you have handled them with the same quiet strength and grace I remember from our childhood together. I have recently returned to the country after several years working abroad, and I find myself, rather unexpectedly, settling into a property not far from your own family's estate. I would be glad to see you again, if you are open to it, not to intrude on whatever healing you are currently undertaking, but simply to reconnect, as old friends, after so many years apart. With warm regards, Henry. Eleanor read the letter twice, a small, involuntary smile forming as memories of those childhood summers came rushing back to her, memories she had not allowed herself to visit in years. She remembered Henry's easy laugh, his patience with her when she had insisted on climbing trees that were clearly too tall for a proper young lady, the quiet, steady kindness that had always defined him, even as a boy. She showed the letter to Charlotte that evening, uncertain exactly how to feel about the unexpected reconnection. Henry Whitfield, Charlotte said, reading the letter with obvious delight. I remember him. He used to follow you around like a devoted puppy every summer. We were children, Eleanor said, though she could feel warmth rising in her cheeks despite herself. You should write back, Charlotte said. There's no harm in reconnecting with an old friend. Eleanor considered the suggestion carefully over the following days, weighing the strange mixture of nervousness and genuine curiosity the letter had stirred inside her. She was not, she reminded herself firmly, looking for romance so soon after the ending of her marriage. She had spent the last several months focused entirely on rebuilding herself, on rediscovering who she was outside the confines of a difficult marriage, and she was not eager to rush into anything that might complicate that careful, ongoing process. And yet she found herself thinking of Henry more often than she expected in the days following the letter, remembering small details from their childhood friendship that had remained tucked away in her memory for years, waiting patiently to resurface. She wrote back eventually, a careful, friendly letter that neither invited nor discouraged further contact, simply expressing genuine warmth at hearing from him after so many years, and a cautious openness to reconnecting, should their paths happen to cross. Henry's response came quickly, warm and easy in tone, suggesting nothing more than a simple visit to catch up on the years that had passed, an invitation Eleanor found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, genuinely looking forward to. They met, several weeks later, in the gardens of her family estate, the same gardens her mother had once tended and Eleanor had recently restored to their former beauty. Henry arrived looking older, of course, the boy she remembered now, a grown man with quiet, steady confidence, and a warmth in his eyes that had not changed at all since their childhood together. You look wonderful, Henry said, as they walked slowly through the garden paths, catching up on the years of separate lives they had each lived since their last conversation, though I suppose that's an inadequate word for everything you've clearly been through. I've had a difficult few years, Eleanor admitted, but I'm finding my way back to myself, slowly. I heard some of the story, Henry said carefully. I hope you don't mind me saying, but from everything I've heard, you handled an impossibly difficult situation, with more grace and strength than most people could have managed. Eleanor felt a warmth rise in her chest at his words, not the flustered warmth of new romance, but something quieter and more grounded, the simple comfort of being truly seen by someone who had known her long before any of the complications of her adult life had begun. Thank you, she said. It's strange, hearing that from someone who remembers who I was before all of it happened. I remember exactly who you were, Henry said, smiling. A girl who once insisted on climbing the tallest tree on my family's property, despite my very reasonable objections, simply because you refused to believe there was anything you couldn't do if you set your mind to it. Eleanor laughed, a genuine, unguarded laugh that surprised her with how easily it came. I'd forgotten about that tree. I haven't, Henry said. I think about that stubborn, fearless girl more often than you might expect. They continued walking through the garden as the afternoon light softened around them, the conversation flowing easily between memories of their shared childhood and gentle, careful updates on the years that had separated them since. Eleanor found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, simply enjoying a conversation, without the careful, guarded caution that had defined so much of her interactions during the final years of her marriage. She did not fall in love with Henry Whitfield that afternoon in the garden. She was not, she reminded herself firmly, ready for anything so significant, so soon after everything she had endured. But she recognized, walking beside an old friend who remembered exactly who she had been before life grew complicated, the quiet, hopeful stirring of possibility, the sense that her future, unlike the carefully constrained years of her marriage, remained entirely unwritten, full of choices that belonged completely to her. As Henry prepared to leave that evening, he paused at the garden gate, turning back to face her with a warmth that felt entirely uncomplicated. I'd like to see you again, he said. No expectations, no pressure. Simply as an old friend, catching up slowly, at whatever pace feels right to you. I'd like that too, Eleanor said, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that she meant it completely. She stood at the garden gate long after his car had disappeared down the winding drive, the evening air cool and quiet around her, and allowed herself, for the first time since the night of the gala, to imagine a future that had nothing at all to do with the marriage she had left behind. A future built entirely on her own terms, filled with choices she alone would make, relationships she alone would decide to pursue, and a sense of self that no one, not even a husband who had once held so much power over her happiness, could ever again diminish. Over the months that followed, Eleanor's life settled into a rhythm she had not experienced since before her marriage, one built entirely around choices that belonged to her alone. She threw herself into restoring her family estate, not merely the physical grounds and buildings, but the sense of purpose the property had once held under her father's careful stewardship. She began managing the estate's finances herself, working closely with Edmund Hale, not as a client seeking legal protection, but as a capable woman building a stable, independent future. She discovered, somewhat to her own surprise, a genuine talent for the work, a sharp, careful mind for business matters that 6 years of marriage had never given her the opportunity to fully explore. Charlotte remained a constant presence throughout this period, the two women growing closer than they had been even during their earliest years of friendship, spending long afternoons together discussing everything from estate management to the small, hopeful developments in Eleanor's gradually deepening friendship with Henry Whitfield. "You're different lately," Charlotte observed one afternoon, the two of them sitting together in the newly restored garden, watching the late afternoon light fall softly across the flower beds Eleanor had spent months carefully bringing back to life. Lighter, more like the Eleanor I remember from before, everything with Julian. "I feel different," Eleanor admitted. "I think I forgot, somewhere during those difficult years, how much I actually enjoy simply being myself, without constantly managing someone else's expectations." "And Henry?" Charlotte asked, a knowing smile forming. Eleanor felt the familiar warmth rise in her cheeks, though she no longer tried to hide it from her closest friend. "Henry is patient," she said carefully. "He doesn't push. He simply continues showing up, consistently, kindly, without ever making me feel rushed toward anything I'm not ready for." "That sounds like exactly what you need." "It is," Eleanor agreed, "though I'm still figuring out exactly what I want, beyond simply enjoying his company." Their gentle, unhurried friendship continued to deepen over the following weeks, Henry visiting regularly, the two of them slowly rebuilding the easy comfort of their childhood connection, while allowing space for something new and adult to grow naturally between them, without force, without expectation, simply following whatever pace felt honest and true. Meanwhile, news of Julian's continuing struggles reached Eleanor occasionally, carried through the usual channels of society gossip that neither of them could fully escape. regardless of how much distance had grown between their separate lives. She heard that several of his family's business partnerships had quietly dissolved in the months following the scandal, wary investors unwilling to continue association with a name that had become, however unfairly in some respects, synonymous with careless, public failure. She heard that his mother, though remaining loyal as any mother would, had grown increasingly distant from her son, disappointed in ways that seemed to run deeper than simply the financial cost of the settlement. She heard, too, that Julian had grown quieter in social settings, less of the confident, commanding presence he had once been, as though the events of that single evening at the gala had permanently altered something fundamental in how he carried himself through the world. Eleanor found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she felt no particular satisfaction in hearing these details, no lingering desire for further vindication beyond what she had already secured. She had wanted freedom and fairness, and the chance to build a life entirely her own. She had never wanted to see Julian permanently broken, and hearing about his continuing struggles brought her, mostly, only a quiet, distant sadness for the marriage that might have been, had he made different choices along the way. "Do you ever think about reaching out to him?" Charlotte asked one afternoon, after another piece of gossip about Julian's diminished standing had reached their circle. "Just to see how he's truly doing?" "No," Eleanor said, after a moment of honest consideration. "I've made my peace with how everything ended. Reaching out now would only reopen a chapter I've worked very hard to close properly." "That's healthy," Charlotte said approvingly. "Though I admit, given everything he put you through, I half expected you to want to see him suffer a little longer." Eleanor smiled, a small, thoughtful expression. "I wanted fairness, Charlotte, not revenge. There's a difference, even if it's not always an easy one to hold on to." As the months continued to pass, Eleanor's confidence in her new life grew steadily stronger. She began attending social events again, not as the quiet, dutiful wife of a prominent duke, but as a woman entirely in her own right, respected for the composed, dignified strength she had shown throughout the difficult ending of her marriage, admired increasingly for the sharp, capable way she now managed her own considerable estate and fortune. Invitations began arriving more frequently, not from families seeking alliance with the Ashcombe name, but from people genuinely interested in Eleanor herself, in her opinions, her company, her growing reputation as a woman who had faced significant hardship and emerged from it not diminished, but somehow more fully herself than she had ever been before. Henry accompanied her to several of these gatherings, their relationship deepening steadily into something Eleanor could no longer deny was becoming genuinely romantic, though both of them continued to move carefully, deliberately, unwilling to rush something that felt, for the first time in either of their lives, worth building with patience rather than urgency. "I'm not in a hurry," Henry told her one evening, as they walked together along the estate's restored garden paths under a sky full of quiet stars. "I've waited years to reconnect with you. I can wait as long as you need, for whatever comes next." "I appreciate that," Eleanor said. "More than you probably realize. I think I understand more than you expect," Henry said gently. "I watched, from a distance, as you built a life around someone else's expectations for 6 years. I have no interest in becoming another person who asks you to shrink yourself to fit his needs." Eleanor stopped walking, turning to face him fully, something warm and grateful settling into her chest as she studied the quiet sincerity in his expression. "You've changed since we were children," she said softly. "But somehow, you're still exactly the person I remember." "I hope that's a good thing," Henry said, smiling. "It's a very good thing," Eleanor said, and reached for his hand, a small, simple gesture that carried within it the quiet promise of a future she was finally, carefully, beginning to allow herself to imagine fully. They stood together in the garden for a long while, neither speaking, simply enjoying the comfortable, easy silence between two people who had known each other, in some form, for nearly their entire lives, and who were only now beginning to discover exactly what that long, patient history might grow into, given the freedom, finally, to choose it fully and honestly, on their own terms, without the shadow of anyone else's expectations standing between them. 1 year after the night that had changed everything, the Hartwell family once again opened their grand ballroom for the annual charity gala, the same event, held in the same gold-lit hall, where Julian Ashcombe had once kissed his mistress, in front of 300 guests, certain the moment would break his wife completely. Eleanor arrived that evening alone, though she no longer thought of herself as alone in any meaningful sense. She had chosen, deliberately, to attend this particular gala without an escort, wanting to walk into that room on her own terms, exactly as she had walked out of it 12 months earlier. She wore a gown of deep emerald green, a color she had chosen entirely for herself this time, with no consideration for family crests or expected appearances. And as she stepped into the ballroom, heads turned throughout the room, whispers rising immediately, though the tone of this year's whispers carried none of the scandalized shock of the year before. "There she is," Lady Prescott murmured to a companion near the entrance. "Eleanor Ashcombe. Though I hear she's simply going by Eleanor Hartley now, her family name." "She looks radiant," the companion replied. "I heard her estate has become one of the most successful in the region this past year, entirely under her own management." Eleanor moved through the room with an ease and confidence that would have been unrecognizable to anyone who had known her only as the quiet, dutiful Duchess of years past. She greeted old friends warmly, exchanged genuine laughter with acquaintances who had grown close to her over the past year, and carried herself with the settled, grounded presence of a woman who had built an entire life from the wreckage of a marriage that had once nearly consumed her completely. Charlotte found her near the refreshment tables, embracing her warmly. "You look happier than I've ever seen you," Charlotte said. "I feel happier than I've ever been," Eleanor admitted, smiling. "Is Henry coming tonight?" "Later," Eleanor said. "He had a small matter to attend to first, but he'll be here." Across the ballroom, near the doors, Julian Ashcombe arrived quietly, his presence far less commanding than it had been the previous year. The months since the settlement had visibly changed him, a certain heaviness settling permanently into his bearing, the confident arrogance that had once defined him, now replaced by something more careful, more subdued. He had come tonight, he told himself, simply because his family's continued presence at such events remained expected, a small but necessary gesture toward rebuilding whatever remained of the Ashcombe family's standing after the difficult year that had passed. He had not expected, walking into the ballroom, to immediately notice Eleanor across the room, laughing freely among a circle of friends, radiating a warmth and confidence that struck him with unexpected force. He watched her for a long moment from across the room, remembering, with painful clarity, the night exactly 1 year earlier, when he had stood in nearly this same spot, certain he held all the power in their marriage, certain that his careless cruelty would break her completely, in front of everyone who mattered. He understood now, watching her laugh freely among genuine friends, dressed in a color she had clearly chosen for herself, carrying herself with an ease he had never once seen from her during their 6 years of marriage, exactly how thoroughly he had misjudged the woman he had once been careless enough to lose. Eleanor noticed him eventually, their eyes meeting briefly across the crowded room, and for a moment, the noise of the gala seemed to fade slightly around them, both of them remembering, without needing to speak, exactly what had transpired in this same room, exactly 1 year before. Julian offered a small, respectful nod, an acknowledgement that carried within it something like genuine apology, though neither of them moved to approach the other. Eleanor returned the nod with quiet grace, and then, without any lingering bitterness or need for further confrontation, she simply turned back to her conversation with Charlotte, the brief exchange settling as final and complete as the settlement papers they had signed nearly a year earlier. Later that evening, as the orchestra began a new song and the dancing resumed across the ballroom floor, Henry arrived, moving through the crowd until he found Eleanor near the tall windows overlooking the estate's gardens, the same windows she had once stood beside during darker, more difficult evenings. "You look beautiful tonight," Henry said, offering his hand. "Thank you for coming," Eleanor said, taking it warmly. "I wouldn't have missed it," Henry said, "not tonight, of all nights." They moved together onto the dance floor, joining the other couples turning slowly beneath the same gold chandeliers that had witnessed, 1 year earlier, the moment that had once seemed to mark the end of everything Eleanor had believed her life would become. Instead, standing now in Henry's steady, gentle embrace, surrounded by friends who had supported her through the most difficult year of her life, Eleanor understood, with complete and settled clarity, that the moment had actually marked the beginning of something far better than anything she had known before. Across the room, Julian watched them dance together for a moment, a quiet, complicated mixture of regret and genuine, unexpected relief settling over him. He had spent the past year believing, in his darkest moments, that he had destroyed something irreplaceable on the night of the gala. Watching Eleanor now, radiant and genuinely happy in a way he had never managed to give her during their years together, he understood, finally and completely, that he had not destroyed anything at all. He had simply set her free. Vivian Cross was nowhere in the room that evening, having rebuilt her life entirely separate from the Ashcombe scandal over the past year. Julian himself remained largely alone, though he had begun, in recent months, the slow and difficult work of understanding exactly where his own choices had led him, a process his mother continued to watch with cautious, guarded hope that her son might yet grow into the steadier, wiser man his own father had once hoped he would become. As the evening continued, Eleanor and Henry stepped away from the dance floor eventually, moving out onto the same balcony where she had once stood alone, years earlier, during the difficult final stretch of her marriage, watching the stars and wondering what her future might hold. "A year ago," Eleanor said quietly, looking out over the moonlit gardens, "I stood in this ballroom and felt, for the first time in years, truly free." "And now?" Henry asked, standing close beside her. "Now," Eleanor said, turning to face him fully, her expression open and unguarded in a way it had not been in longer than she could remember. "I feel something even better than freedom. I feel like myself again, completely, without needing anyone else's permission or approval to become exactly who I want to be." Henry smiled, reaching for her hand once more. "I think," he said gently, "that might be the most important kind of freedom there is." Below them, the gardens stretched out quiet and beautiful under the summer night sky. The same gardens where, 1 year earlier, Eleanor had begun the long, careful process of reclaiming her own life. Behind them, inside the ballroom, the orchestra continued playing, the gala continuing on exactly as it had the year before, though everything that truly mattered had changed completely. Eleanor Hartley, no longer the quiet, dutiful duchess she had once been, stood on that balcony, beside a man who had known and valued her long before any title had ever defined her, and she allowed herself, finally and completely, to simply enjoy the life she had fought so patiently, so carefully, to build entirely her own. The smile that had confused an entire ballroom exactly 1 year earlier no longer needed any explanation at all. It had simply become, in the year since, the natural, settled expression of a woman who had finally, fully, found her way home to herself.